It's going to be a bit of a whirlwind, I think, given the breadth of this topic, but we're very, very excited for it. So I'm going to very quickly introduce our authors, and then we'll get straight into it, I think. So I have here Gracie May Bradley, a writer and an activist who wrote Against Borders, The Case for Abolition. And I also have, if I can get the book out at the correct point, Andreas Hackl, a lecturer in anthropology and development at the University of Edinburgh, who wrote The Invisible Palestinians and the Hidden Struggle for Inclusion in Jewish Tel Aviv. So one of the reasons that we decided to do this event was because it built on the work or the event that we had last year on borders. And as our world seems to slowly become more and more frightening in many ways for many people, those who consider themselves belonging and not, this seemed like quite an important thing to broach and to discuss amongst ourselves. What is it that we want the world to look like, and what is it that's uncomfortable about the way that we live at the moment? So hopefully we will take you on a journey, raise questions, and then you will have the chance to ask questions at the end of the event. So keep them in mind and don't be shy. And at the end, if you can't ask your question in front of everybody here, there will be a signing at the back. So please join me in welcoming our speakers. So as discussed, I keep the questions open, but I hope that you will answer in whatever detail and specificity that you would like to, given how incredibly detailed and thoughtful your books are. So my first question is, what is citizenship intended to be? What is it that we think it should be?
I can start there. I have to say, this is the first event that I've done on this book. You see it's co-authored. My co-author's Luke de Nerona, and this is actually the first event I've done on the book without Luke. So I've got like twice as much that I need to say. I'm used to kind of just bouncing things over to him for him to finish half my sentence. So if I trail off, you'll know why. Well, I suppose the good faith account of citizenship is that it tells us how we relate to the state. The nice, cozy relationship that those of us who are secure have with the states that govern us. It tells us what obligations the state owes to us and what our responsibilities are to the state. So, we should be not committing crimes and sharing our passport when we leave and when we come back. We should be somewhat civically minded. We should care about the spaces that we live in. We should uphold British values that nobody's ever managed to define. And in return, the state will make sure that we're housed, will make sure that we have welfare benefits, that we can access healthcare, that we have labor rights, and so on and so forth. That's meant to be the contract between the citizen and the state. That's the good faith view, I would say, in a nutshell.
Yeah, it's difficult to add anything that you haven't mentioned, but I would say that the citizenship has this unifying, idea behind it. It is a unifying force, ideally, in theory, something that unites people, something that connects those that are also potentially different. And I think that's where the main questions come up. Is the different kinds of citizenship in terms of whatever the nationalism of the particular state is it based on ethnicity historically, or is it a kind of multicultural form of citizenship? But even in states that are considering themselves to be very diverse and very multicultural, citizenship is also always a divisive force. So I think for me, one of the really interesting questions is around that tension between citizenship as something that unites people, but at the same time as something that divides people.
Well, I think that might be an excellent segue into the next question, which is, what are the conditions of citizenship, and where do we find the borders of it? Where do we find that it is policed? And who do we find? So yeah,
one of the things I've been very interested in is actually this question of conditionality, and that comes out in my book in the sense that what are the conditions for Palestinians who are also citizens of Israel to access certain opportunities, to actually feel at home in a city that is, one of the foremost Jewish Israeli cities, Tel Aviv. What does it mean to be Palestinian there? And in the Palestinian Israeli context, one of the ideas around conditionality is rooted in you could almost say in colonial history. It's the idea of the good Arab. Who is a good Arab? This stereotypical idea of the good Arab suggests that good Arabs are hardworking, they are loyal to Israel in the sense that they are not extremists. A good Arab would be someone who expresses or who confirms the legitimacy of the Israeli state. It would certainly not be someone who is, wearing the Palestinian scarf and goes out to protest. So this trope of the good Arab is one of the things that came out on my research in citizenship among Palestinians in Israel. But there are many other of these ideal type, you could say, metaphors that actually tell us what conditionality is about. People talk about good Muslims, or what does it mean to be a good citizen? And I think that relates to a lot of kind of conditions, including ideas of, conditions around behavior. The idea that you are a good citizen if you participate in political life. But there are also ideas about things that you need to hide, conditions that impose on certain minority citizens to hide certain things, to not be overtly radical in ways that would conflict with the dominant idea of citizenship. And there are many other conditions like that, but I'll pass it over to you.
So I suppose I could speak to that second part of the question around where citizenship is being policed. So Luke and I, in our book, we discuss this mainly in the chapter that's called Counter-Terror, but the argument that we're making throughout the book is that there are lots of different forms of coercive state power that need to be understood as linked to one another. So yes, the discussion of citizenship is in the Counter-Terror chapter, but in that chapter, we're talking not just about citizenship stripping on grounds of national security, we're also talking about people who've been on the Metropolitan Police's gangs matrix, for example, who've been trying to make claims for citizenship and have then been told, no, actually, your presence isn't conducive to the public good. So all of these different kind of hard edges of state power are mutually reinforcing, and we shouldn't see them in silos. I suppose, obviously, there are really stark limit cases that show us about the conditionality of citizenship. So the case of Shamima Begum, for example, has been really instrumental, unfortunately, in illuminating how citizenship in the UK is conditional for certain people. There have been citizenship stripping powers on the statute books for decades in the UK, so since the 1970s, but they weren't used at all until 2002. So the war on terror has massively shaped how citizenship works in this country, essentially. So it's in 2002 that successive governments, it wasn't, not just the Tories, also New Labour, it was under New Labour that this became more and more prevalent. More and more people were being stripped of their citizenship. And what we saw successive amendments to the law that lowered the threshold for stripping people of citizenship. There's always been grounds to strip people where they've obtained their citizenship fraudulently. It used to be the case that, you would have to be a naturalized British citizen to be stripped of your citizenship. The threshold is now much lower, so that if you could maybe claim citizenship of another place, even if you don't hold it yet, the government says that's enough for us to be confident that we won't make you stateless and we might take your citizenship anyway. And that was the argument that was made in respect of Shamima Begum. They said, well, you could be a citizen of elsewhere. Actually, that other government was saying she won't be welcome here, she's not a citizen now. So there was a real risk that she'd be left stateless. Under the initial citizenship stripping powers, nobody would be left stateless. It was dual nationals and so on. But that threshold has come down. And we've also seen the threshold come down away from essentially national security and counter-terror, bad enough as that was, we saw with the Rochdale grooming gangs, and these were men who did commit serious sexual crimes, cause significant social harm. Those men were stripped of their citizenship, and that's the first time that we've seen citizenship stripped on the grounds of serious organised crime. So the thresholds are getting lower and lower. The thread that is pretty continuous is that this is mainly happening to racialized people. So there are different kinds of citizenship for different kinds of citizens. Minoritized people do not have the same citizenship as people who can trace their ancestry back much longer, and that's where we're seeing increasing policing.
Amazing, thank you. So perhaps on that, where does nativism come into ideas of citizenship? Why are we seeing it, I guess?
I mean, I guess to go back to your very first question around what is citizenship intended to do, I suppose there's also something about it's supposed to tell us where we belong. It's supposed to tell us which bit of the world we belong in, which political community we belong to. And of course, if you have an inside, there has to be an outside. And I think that's kind of where nativism comes in, because we see people negatively defining themselves against, well, I belong, I'm indigenous, I look this way, you do not belong, you do not look this way, you do not behave this way, you don't belong. I think that's where we're seeing that kind of nativism come in. I suppose the reality is that in kind of, post-war, war on terror is not over, okay, continuing war on terror, post-2008 austerity and so on, citizenship is meaning less and less. States are doing less and less for their citizens. States that used to ostensibly do a lot more, at least for, their metropolitan citizens, there isn't a social wage anymore. Benefits aren't enough for people to live on. And I suppose that's the argument that Luke and I are making in the book, is that, and it's not just our argument, obviously, but nationalism, this kind of national belonging, is the story that you can tell people so that they'll go to sleep at night thinking that they have something more than others, right? Thinking, okay, well, we belong, this is ours, when actually they don't share the class interests of a lot of the other people in the nation. It's an incredibly effective block to transnational working class solidarity if you tell people, well, this is a citizen, this isn't a citizen, this is where you belong, and that person doesn't belong here. So I think that's quite a significant function of nativism. It's making people identify against their own class interests.
Yeah, I mean, maybe to just turn the question a little bit to talk about what, because there's another aspect of nativism, or maybe not nativism, but the natives when you talk about citizenship, and that sort of also relates to quite a surprising finding perhaps, that you can see a lot of similarities between these ideas of good and bad citizens today and ideas about colonial times or settler colonies today, who is actually a good indigenous minority citizen and who is a bad indigenous minority citizen. And it's quite surprising how the power of citizenship to be a divisive force as a means of controlling people, I think in a way has actually emerged through colonialism, where the question was, well, you are different from us. You might be, an indigenous person in a particular country that is colonized, and in order for you to qualify as someone who might get citizenship or who might actually be recognized as a good indigenous subject, you'd have to do A, B, and C. You have to, moderate your radicalism. You should not be against the states, and there's this idea of using elites of indigenous populations as a means to expand political control of colonial territories, and that's even sort of in the book, The Invisible Palestinians. As I briefly mentioned before, I also talk about how this idea of the good Arab is connected to other cases around the world, whether that's Algeria and colonialism there, where it was about Berbers and Arabs and the differences between them, or it's actually connected to really, really old ideas about good savages and bad savages and things like that. So I think the natives in that sense and citizenship have very sort of complex connection, really. Yeah.
Absolutely, and I think that these are things that kind of, each time you've kind of raised these points, I've been able to think of very specific ideas, either in my life or in the lives of people I've read about, of either citizenship not holding true to what it is meant to be, or the very vast hypocrisy within it that very much gets exposed. At this point, I would also just like to, I guess, mention Ala Abdel Fattah, who is a British Egyptian citizen and is currently incarcerated, and no one knows his condition at this point. But the thing that people were hoping was that perhaps we could get some understanding of how he is through British citizenship, through consular access. However, the Egyptian authorities are saying he's not really a British citizen because he got his British citizenship out of a specific arbitrary administrative order. He was in pre-trial detention at the time, I believe. So this idea of citizenship it's not enough. It's not giving him the protection that we desperately need him to have. And at the same time, we have politicians who will refer to him either as British Egyptian or British. Either he is British with a condition of being Egyptian, or he is full British, and it very much shows the difference between whether or not someone really will put the effort in to try and get someone to help him. So kind of with these examples, with these interludes, I'm kind of quite interested to know a little bit about, so this is something that Andreas is working on now. You're working on kind of technology, and this is something that you talk about a lot, Gracie, in your book, about ideas of the way that technology currently is enabling us to kind of monitor, understand, track citizenship. And I'd like to spend a little bit of time on this because it's something that I think we can talk a lot about the political ramifications, but it's kind of interesting to know that at some point we become numbers, right? And at some point we become pieces of data. So I'd just like to discuss that and how that works. So first of all, how it works, and then we'll see how we manage to develop that.
I'll start. So the chapters in Against Borders that are on databases and algorithms really came, in part at least, out of a lot of work that I did when I was working at Liberty, and I was working across policing, counter-terror, immigration, and surveillance. So I was really having to look at how all of these systems fit together. And I suppose one of my really salient experiences in doing that work was essentially the tech person in the policy team left. She was really brilliant. She left, and I was landed with doing all of Liberty's advocacy on the Data Protection Bill 2017. And I had only really done, I came to Liberty from kind of working at migrants' rights organizations. Like, I was not a tech person per se at all, but I had to get on top of the brief because that is the job. And in the Data Protection Bill 2017, the government introduced an immigration exemption. So the purpose of that bill was essentially to give effect to the EU General Data Protection Regulation in UK law. That was the point of it. It was meant to be about giving us good data protection rights. But the government wanted to insert this immigration exemption, which basically said your data protection rights could be set aside if your data was being processed for immigration control purposes. This is an exemption that they tried to introduce, I think it was in the 70s. No, it was in the 80s, Data Protection Bill in 1983 and 1984, and had been struck out on the grounds that it was too racist for the House of Lords at the time. So this was the government trying to have another go at it. And what was very interesting and formative for me was being essentially like the only racialized person in the NGO groups that were working on this aspect of the bill. Most of the time, the only woman. And the thing with this exemption is that it was and is making it a lot easier for data from essential public services to be shared with the Home Office for immigration enforcement. This was happening anyway, and is something I'd done a lot of campaigning on, but this exemption was going to make it even easier. So the material impact of it was going to be more likely to have people deterred from going to the doctor, sending their kids to school, disclosing crimes to the police, all of this kind of stuff. But there are a lot of kind of very white liberal NGOs who basically just wanted to say, look, the main argument that we'll put to Parliament is that it's going to make it harder for migrants to make subject access requests. It's going to make it harder for them to get data out of the Home Office and make a legal claim. So you just had this huge schism in how we wanted to present what was at stake. Did we want to talk about what was really at stake, or did we want to talk about the relatively technical legal thing that people thought wouldn't scare the horses and, you know, might make some Tories say that this thing was bad? Which, yeah, so I mean, that was my introduction to all of this stuff. We, you know, the other thing with that clause is that it was going to make it much easier for private sector data brokers to have a big role in processing immigration data in the UK. So companies like Palantir, for example, it was going to make it much easier for them to just set aside their data protection obligations and say, we'll build you this tool, or we'll be data brokers, and so on and so forth. Very long story short, as is often the way when you're lobbying in Parliament, we didn't succeed at getting that clause struck out completely. We did completely unexpectedly, because there was a hung Parliament and because the Tories were just having to fold on everything, we did unexpectedly get, there was a data sharing deal around migrant health data, and we essentially managed to get that deal stopped because, one, everybody changed party, so I can't remember what party she was in by the time everybody was done becoming a Lib Dem. But anyway, there was somebody changed party. She essentially kind of corralled a load of MPs to say, let's take down this health data deal, even if we can't get rid of this whole immigration exemption. So we won something, we didn't win it all, that's the way that it goes. But I think my point is, which I've made in not a very concise way, my point is that often advocacy on tech and data protection has made it all about the right to privacy. And it's been a kind of view from nowhere. This is what would happen to the average person on the street. This is what would happen to your privacy rights, so on and so forth. That's how advocacy has often been framed. And where we've maybe spoken about specific groups, it's still been in these very narrow technical, oh, well, it means you can't make a subject access request kind of terms. And what's been completely missing from the conversation has been the point that the Home Office, having loads of different data sharing deals with basically every government department, the Department for Education, the Department of Health, Department for Work and Pensions, independent bodies on banking. Yes, all of this is a kind of privacy data protection issue, but fundamentally what it's doing is it means that there's a whole class of people, undocumented migrants, who can't go to their GP without fear of being deported, can't send their kids to school, can't hold a bank account, can't claim benefits, even the very narrow benefits that they're entitled to. And the fulcrum on which all of that kind of denial and immiseration rests is essentially shadowy data sharing deals. And that's about a lot more than the right to privacy. So I think there's been a whole kind of conceptual failure because it's all been framed purely in terms of privacy rights, and people haven't been understanding or explaining the kind of material impact that a lot of this infrastructure is having on people's lives.
Yeah, so for me, the relationship between this conversation on citizenship and digital technology, I mean, there is a chapter in the book, The Invisible Palestinians, that also talks about Palestinians working in Israeli high-tech, which is in itself an interesting conversation, how inequality and the high-tech sector are interacting. But I think partly because of that, I got very interested in the digital economy at large. And my current work is actually on what does this digital economy mean for refugees? And one of the things we see is that to a large extent, digital forms of work, such as online freelancing, micro work, work through platforms and e-commerce, and this whole conversation around this basically reinforces the exile of refugees in the digital space. So the lack of citizenship in a lot of places, and at the moment I'm working with the International Labour Organization and UNHCR on this large project where we are mapping the inclusion of refugees in the digital economy across 8 countries in the Middle East and Africa. And what you see is that not only do refugees often not even have access to SIM cards because the identity they have available, the documentation they have available is not accepted by SIM card registration providers. They also cannot often access bank accounts because of the same problem that their IDs are not accepted. They cannot open profiles on freelancing platforms because they don't meet what is called know your customer requirements, which again requires them to have identification such as a passport or national citizenship, which they don't have in many cases. I won't go into details, but basically what this research, and I'm also working on my next book on that topic, basically the idea is that the lack of inclusion in society at large, in the economy, the exclusions from citizenship, all of this, and the condition of exile and being a forcibly displaced person is even, reinforced and mirrored by the digitalization of the economy. And unless people do something now and very soon, the future of work, as it is often called, is going to make things probably worse rather than better for refugees in these new forms of work. And the last problem being, of course, that all of these forms of work are precarious, gig work, without social protections, without protection under the labor codes and labor rights of particular countries. So on top of the exclusion from accessing these forms of work, they are also under, at risk, disadvantaged, they're disproportionately at risk of being exploited, of sort of suffering from those conditions. So I'd say technology and citizenship are in quite a problematic relationship these days.
Thank you both. So this, I think, leads me to the next part of my question on technology, which is, for many of us, it's difficult to grasp what is happening. And with the amount of technological advancement, algorithms changing, people like policies going through, and the lack of information about what people are going through as a result of these technological advancements or the way that the economy is changing. Where are the sources of information that we can find in order to understand it and see what progress is being made in this? And then who do we tell? Because I don't think I hear very many people, and I also don't think I understand well enough myself how to explain it, and then how to find some form of representation, political representation that would take that on. I think unions do it. I think activists do it. But I'd be interested to know how you follow and where we can then do our bit.
I think importantly we need to be specific, since like new technologies, that can be everything from a digital wallet to a self-driving car, or whatever it is. So I think the first step to actually finding information is to know what you're looking for. So basically engaging with technology in a sense of understanding how particular spheres of life and the economy are being reshaped. And I think there's a growing amount of publications, but also campaigns around issues such as fair work in the gig economy. There's something called the Fair Work Foundation, for example, that is led by a variety of people, but based at the Oxford Internet Institute and others. And I think these are examples of campaigns that work, but at the same time, I think there's a problem around organizing against the impact of technology, precisely because not just things such as algorithmic control or algorithms you also talk about in your book, but to come back to the idea of refugees in the digital economy, or basically everyone in the gig economy, with these platforms classifying workers as self-employed, independent contractors. In a lot of places, they don't really have any access to unionization even. Then you have this growing isolation of the worker, people working on platforms based in their homes, on computers, in refugee camps as well, where electricity is only working half a day. And how should they organize? How should they actually create the capital, the institutions, and the assets that they need to bargain for improved conditions? And I think this is one of the main challenges in the road ahead for radical organizing against exploitation by technology, by corporations in the sphere of work and the economy. So I don't know about other spheres, but this is one thought I had. I don't know if that was too far away from what you asked, but yeah.
Been signed up.
Thank you very much.
So I suppose a lot of mine and Luke's work and organising has been UK-based. Luke's done quite a lot of research with people who've been deported from the UK to Jamaica, but my experience is not international in that way, and I think that our assumption is that our readers are mainly going to be in the global north, so that's kind of the perspective that I'm speaking to. One of the arguments that we make is that abolition needs to be digitally literate, but another argument that we make is that, every new tool or new piece of technology is obviously inserted into the ground of the world as it is, and we may not be tech experts, but I feel activists have a huge amount of knowledge about power and power dynamics, who's excluded, who's included, perspectives that are often completely missed when it comes to weighing up whether or not a new technology should exist or how it works or who it's for and so on. So I feel like we shouldn't assume that we're completely inexpert in this space. Actually, there is a lot that we know and a lot that we have to contribute. It's just different from the way the space is currently framed. We also make the argument that, border abolition it's not technophobic per se. We're not, as you alluded to, we're not saying all tech is bad. If we accept, though, that we are on the ground of a world that is racist and transphobic and sexist and, and so on, most tech is going to end up reproducing the inequalities that already exist in the world. That's what we have to be aware of. And obviously, there's tech that might be completely benign or developed for an ostensibly totally benign purpose that is then repurposed for ends that are completely terrible. And we're at a point now where it's actually pretty naive and irresponsible of people to think, oh no, that would never get used for that. Like, just assume it's going to be used for that and work backwards, right? In terms of how I got on, I spoke earlier about getting on top of the brief. I think it depends how you learn. I'm an only child, I will just sit and read on my own, and then I'll be like, I understand it. That isn't how everybody learns. We wrote this book thinking about, people maybe being able to take chapters to reading groups, for example. So I think kind of whatever you read, there are a lot of great intersectional authors on tech and social justice. So people like Safia Noble, who wrote Algorithms of Oppression, Simone Brown, who wrote Dark Matters. Who else did I read? I read Andrew Guthrie Ferguson, who wrote The Rise of Big Data Policing. Like, there's a lot of really great, interesting books on tech and social justice, but I would say it might help to not read them on your own. It might help to pick chapters and read them with other people, and then think about how they chime with the knowledge that you already have and what you already know. Like I say, don't assume that you don't know anything. But crucially, I think, and it's always a tactical decision, often when something is new, that is the time when it gets all of the heat and the light and the scrutiny, and that's the time where there's like quite a big window open for potentially making that thing not happen at all. It's not impossible to stop things when they're already entrenched. but it's a different kind of campaigning, and I think it takes a different kind of resources. So I'm not too skeptical of people jumping on the new thing and saying, hang on a minute, what is it? How does it work? Do we want it to work this way? I think that that can often be really quite successful, but ultimately the problem is the exclusionary logic. So yes, we can firefight, and yes, we can say ban facial recognition, no algorithmic decision-making where it will have a significant impact on human rights. Like, we can go for all of those non-reformist policy asks, but they will only kind of stem the tide. Even if we're successful, they kind of just keep us in the status quo. And what they're not undoing is getting rid of that fundamental logic of the state that says, there are people that we want to exclude. We want to sort people so that they don't have access to certain public services. And I think the only way we really get around that is by doing the big, positive, bold campaigning for universal public services, for defunding immigration control, and so on. So we shouldn't get stuck on the tech, but we do need to understand it, because it will make things go very fast and be way more effective than we want them to be.
Thank you both. So I've got another couple of questions, and in that time, I remind our audience that you will have some time for questions very soon, so rack your brains. So you've just touched somewhat on, in your book, you talk about non-reformist reforms. So could I ask you to kind of discuss that a little bit more, what you mean, and kind of some more examples of that? And then both of you in your books talk about the struggle that people take against citizenship, or within places that don't accept them fully, either individual or collective. And I was interested by the contrast of what the outcomes or what people's lives are like with those in mind. So having thrown you two questions in one, I'll leave you to decide how you want to answer them.
Okay, so Against Borders, The Case for Abolition, it is an abolitionist book. And by that we mean, we're thinking about how do we work towards a world without borders. Obviously, Ruthie Gilmore tells us abolition is not just about getting rid of carceral, punitive policies and so on that we don't like. It's also about building. It's about presence. It's thinking, what would we need in the world? How might we relate to one another? What different configurations of belonging might there be that actually we don't rely on borders to do X, Y, Z? That's what we mean when we say it's an abolitionist book, and it draws very deeply on kind of Black feminist thought and strategy in making those abolitionist arguments. I suppose because one of the audiences, or a couple of the audiences for the book, are kind of people who are working in NGOs or working in the legal sector, the kind of work that Luke and I have both done at times, we're thinking about the kinds of demands that we can make in the here and now that are not going to make that abolitionist world get further away from us. So a non-reformist reform is essentially, yes, it's a change in the here and now. There's nobody who doesn't want things to change right now, but we're thinking, okay, what reforms can we ask for now that aren't going to make our work more difficult going forward? Because sometimes, or really a lot of the time, people go for reforms that ultimately make that abolitionist goal get further and further away. So very often prison abolitionists talk about the fact that prison itself was a reform. It aimed to reform the death penalty, and of course produced all kinds of social harm and immiseration as a result. Luke and I adapted a resource that was developed in the 1970s by the activist group Critical Resistance. So they have a kind of 5 questions that you can ask to help you figure out, is a reform a reformist reform or a non-reformist reform? We're not saying that it's not a formula. There's not always going to be a super easy answer. It's not put a few inputs in and you get the answer out at the other end. But they're just critical questions that might help shape our thinking. And again, they're not intended to be one person sits down on their own and gets an answer. They're things that are meant to be thought about in groups and tested out, and we're meant to learn from them. And, maybe some of those questions are wrong. But, fundamentally, I think we can ask ourselves, is it something that's going to give more resources to the border regime? Are we calling for more immigration? Or are we calling for more border force staff? Are we calling for more technology or tools for border force staff? If we can identify whether or not the calls that we're making are pouring money and resources into the system that we want to weaken, the odds are that that's a reformist reform. Similarly, if what we're calling for assumes that migrants are a problem that need to be solved, that's going to be a reformist reform. So something like, I think it was, Corbyn proposed a migrant impact fund, the Tory government brought in the controlling migration fund. The underlying logic of both was that migrants are a problem, putting pressure on public services. This is the solution. That's not going to bring an abolitionist world any closer. Campaigning for universal public services without having to buy into the logic that migrants are doing anything to anyone, that's a non-reformist reform. So anyway, we set out 5 of those questions in the book, and they're not supposed to be exhaustive. They draw on those questions by critical resistance. Some of us a couple of years ago got together and actually rethought them in the UK context for policing, and they're hosted on the Abolitionist Futures website. So yeah, they're questions, they're not answers.
Yeah, I guess my perspective on this is sort of related to the second part of the title of the book, which talks about the hidden struggle for inclusion of Palestinians in Tel Aviv. And one thing that I found striking also in a Palestinian context, when you talk about what do people struggle for when they are struggling against exclusions connected to citizenship. And you find that, of course, a lot of the literature and conversations around struggles is about loud struggles. It's about people, bearing flags. It's about the question of how can we get recognition for our special status as a minority. But what I found is that in the context of Palestinians who try to access a city such as Tel Aviv, a city dominated by the Jewish Israeli majority in a state that continues to be affected by conflict and polarization. So they struggle in different ways, and of course there are also protests, activism, there are people bearing flags, but at the same time you have invisible struggles. There are struggles such as a student at Tel Aviv University that is in the book who is a Palestinian citizen of Israel and a proud activist who organized events around the commemoration of the Palestinian Nakba, the displacement of 750,000 Palestinians from their homeland. He was active in this field, but at the same time he was a student at Tel Aviv University who was studying to become a lawyer in Israel. He was applying for internships at Israeli law offices. So he told me, wearing the kufiya, the Palestinian scarf, when we sat in his apartment, that, look, I'm not going to wear this scarf if I'm in Tel Aviv. I'm going to take down some of the political stuff from my Facebook because I'm applying for internships at law offices. And these and other struggles, such as people hiding particular things, employees in offices taking their Arabic necklaces off, or strategic decisions about what you do in what situation or what you don't do in a different situation, such as Palestinian citizens often feel compelled to perhaps avoid speaking Arabic when they're crossing, let's say, the security check on the entrance to a train station, because sometimes if they do speak Arabic, they'll be checked, they'll be profiled. So it is about, okay, if you need to be somewhere on time, you maybe don't speak Arabic. So these are really sad examples because, of course, to struggle in such an invisible way doesn't lead to recognition. It doesn't actually build up to the point that you could say you're transforming the system. But you're still struggling for inclusion, you're struggling for mobility, you're struggling for access to things. And so one of the things, to come back to your question about how do people struggle, that I try to explain in the book, The Invisible Palestinians, is that there are a lot of quiet struggles of people around the world for citizenship. They are also claims for citizenship, claims for equality, but sometimes they look more like compromises. They aren't always resistance. And I think it's really important to understand that some contexts that are particularly sensitive, complex, oppressive, require different kinds of strategies, and many of them can be quiet and invisible.
I think that also really comes across in the book. You talk to like 3 artists. Throughout you're talking about you're talking to several people who give that information. And I think what I also found quite interesting was that there's not necessarily a desire to reclaim Tel Aviv, so much as often a desire, or not always a desire, but often there is a desire to make the most of it in almost a utilitarian sense, in order to continue and to make a life that you want. Which I think is interesting, right? Because citizenship is often this idea of like, you should be included in everything. And some people are saying, I know I won't be, but I will make the most of what this will give me so that I have a better life elsewhere, or I do something better for myself. And I guess it's a very honest look at the state of affairs. Unless there's anything further, I'm going to open it out to audience questions, and Ailey has a microphone. Do we have any questions? Pop your hands up. Don't be shy. We're super friendly.
Hi, thanks for the talk. It's been really interesting. When you talked about those quieter struggles that often don't see recognition, it seems to me as a queer autistic person that there's a lot of parallels with being closeted or having to mask in a public situation, which is like to pretend to be neurotypical and hide your traits of being neurodivergent so that you can get along in a culture that's designed for neurotypicals. Do you think there is like a useful way to borrow that language or to come up with a parallel that covers the quiet struggles that you were talking about? And if so, what kind of ideas for words would you pitch?
I think I understood most of your question. It's just an acoustic thing, but it is about the parallels between queer struggles and the quiet struggles I've been talking about mainly. Do I understand it right? Yes, yeah. I mean, yes, there's this tension about visibility, and I don't want to go back to this whole idea of racial passing or of this idea of people. I mean, there's a lot of conversations around this in the context of racial inequalities and racism, but I think the parallels between LGBTQ plus activism and the Palestinian situation became quite clear in my own research. Like, one of the chapters in the book actually talks a lot about the Palestinian queer scene in Tel Aviv, and there's always this tension around, on the one hand, visibility, but on the other hand, co-optation, because Israel and Tel Aviv especially has been, kind of highlighting the fact that, we are the paradise for the gay community, and Palestinians who are gay can come to Tel Aviv to basically seek refuge, and we'll protect them, and they can do everything what they cannot do in Palestinian society, let's say. So that there's this idea of being co-opted. But the problem is that if Palestinians in Tel Aviv try to take part in this, Jewish Israeli-dominated spaces, they often feel like they're excluded, discriminated, or marginalized because of their Palestinian identity. On the other hand, when they make their Palestinian identity more visible and they reject these, normalized spaces that pretend to say that the diversity respecting gay rights outweighs the exclusion of Palestinian rights. So once they do make their Palestinian identity more visible, then they are again stigmatized for their Palestinian identity. So it's either the one or the other, and I think the complexity around those struggles and the parallels are that invisibility is a tool, but it often feels wrong, right? It doesn't really lead to recognition unless the strategic invisibility can take you to a place from which you're stronger to then fight for recognition. And that's something Palestinians in Tel Aviv said every once in a while, that we're using their opportunities to be stronger against them. And sometimes getting into a position of power requires strategic compromises, but unfortunately I think I haven't answered your question too well, but happy to talk more about it.
You might have to come to me, if that's okay.
Oh, come to the mic, if you come to the front.
Could you say what we might do to become less complicit and accepting of the intrusion of the state into civic society? Because there's a range, seems to be a range, because in this country we put up with such intrusions into the state that would be unimaginable in, say, the Netherlands or France, which are not too far away. For example, the Netherlands, they have a living memory of what it was like in the local authority of the state held a record of their family's religion. In France, the Ministry of Interior there can tell you from which countries foreign residents living in France originate, where they came from, before they came to France, on working visas. They even be applying for citizenship. But the French Ministry of the Interior can tell you what percentage of their citizens are of any ethnicity, because they're French, and that's it. They're a civic society. They don't know if they're Catholic, Jewish, African, Asian. The state doesn't keep the record because they just thought it was very important to be a secular state in the 18th century. They seem to have kept it, but we'll willingly give up all sorts of information that the French consider really private, and they'll do that every time we fill in an equal opportunities form. I was wondering what would happen since.
I'm just going to really quickly, I think, just for the audience at home, just repeat what I think the ultimate question is, which is how do we not necessarily conform to giving up all of our data that is often a part of being a citizen in the UK, like information about who we are and how we are.
Yeah, I'm just sitting here going, because, I mean, the French example is a complicated one, though. So I studied French. I lived in France for quite a long time. And the thing with the French government not collecting the ethnicity data is that it's also used as a pretext to be like, there is no racism in France. So it's used as a kind of institutional refusal to see certain things. So that's a problem. At the same time, obviously, one of the arguments that Luke and I make really strongly in the book is that while obviously our kind of citizenship and immigration regime is massively exclusionary, and in particular of certain groups of people, so if you want to be a person on the move, but you can't enter the labor market, for example, if you're disabled or if you're not of working age, you find it much harder to move than other people. If you're moving as a spouse, for example, you have to kind of disclose all kinds of stuff about your relationship. If you're claiming asylum on the grounds of, being LGBTQ, you might be asked all kinds of really invasive questions, or, the Home Office might try and stalk your Facebook and stuff to see if what you're saying is true. So there are all of these ways that our immigration and citizenship system forces people to try and make themselves legible to the state. And while obviously we want disabled people to be able to move, and we want spouses to be able to move independent of their partners, we want LGBTQ people to be able to seek safety, I agree, we don't want to make making yourself legible to the state in really intimate ways a condition of that. So it's complicated. But I mean, in terms of, I've only been in Scotland a year or so I'm not too au fait with kind of how intrusive Scotland is versus how intrusive England is. I mean, I think, in fact, I'm not gonna get into the pandemic. Yeah, essentially, I think the French example that you raise and the whole French concept of secularism and laïcité, it works against racialized people actually quite intensely. It's not as simple as, well, we don't have to disclose this stuff and our state is still great. It's actually, you know, France is as racist and discriminatory, and in specific ways more so than other states in Europe. It also means that the government has an excuse to say that it can't see it and that there's a veneer of everything's fine over the top. But, you know, the state can legislate to say that Muslim women can't wear certain things on the beach and so on. So, you know, I think it's a bit more complicated than that. I'll leave it there.
Do we have a final question? Just one here.
Hi, I don't know if I fully thought this through yet, but I guess I'm trying to understand, like, if we were to shift what, like how rights are determined away from citizenship, like how voting might come in your understanding, because I guess...
We can't quite hear you.
Can you hear, is this better?
Yes.
Right, sorry. Okay, so I guess I'm trying to understand, like, what maybe the role of, like, voting would be if we're kind of shifting our understanding of citizenship, because, like, I have a very privileged position where in some countries I'm eligible to vote even though I don't live there, and in some I'm eligible to vote even though I don't hold a passport. And I guess, like, that makes me really question what citizenship and voting do to each other. But if we're trying to remove kind of citizenship as this, like, barrier, like, where would voting come in? Is that a thing we would still do? You know, like, I'm curious about your ideas, because I'm sure in, like, for Palestinians that's going to play a really huge role in where the say can come in at all. So yeah.
I'll just say something briefly, but I think it's more Grace's place to answer that. Among Palestinian citizens of Israel, one of the things that is often highlighted as they're equal to Jewish Israeli citizens is that they can vote. But I think the real question is, how does this, you know, nominally equal right to vote translate into equal outcomes or rights to do whatever you want? And the system clearly shows the limits of freedom of speech for Palestinian citizens if, for example, they are deemed too radical by the dominant establishment, or they are having connections with some of the neighboring countries that are deemed enemy states by Israel, or they say something wrong and they're constantly monitored and their speech is, so let's say Palestinian citizens of Israel who are members of the Israeli parliament, I'd say they're constantly monitored for potential transgressions of what is considered to be acceptable within their right to be elected and to vote. And so although there is equality in the right to vote, it is also policed to what extent you can live out that theoretical equality.
Yeah, this is a great question, and it brings to mind, so when I said, it was a few years ago now that Luke and I started writing this book, but I mentioned it to an old boss, and she just said, borders are essential to democracy. And I was like, what? But clearly we've been thinking about these things in really different ways, so I think it's a good question. I suppose the point I make about abolition being about presence and not just absence is that we're not kind of saying, let's just take citizenship out of the equation, or like, let's take immigration controls out of the equation. The question is really like, what kinds of democracy would we need to build for this not to be our default? And Luke and I, we don't have a blueprint for that. So right at the end of the book, there are a couple of fictional interludes. One of them is very dystopian, one of them is more utopian, although it's quite contested and things are going okay, but not necessarily great. Anyway, the point is that, in that utopia, there are kind of completely different units of political belonging that are really, really local, but that are structured in such a way that people can make decisions on a continental scale in a participatory way. And so I think that's what's at the heart of your question. And voting, okay, fine, all some people do is vote, and that's fine. But there are so many other ways of kind of being involved in political decisions, doing politics that's got actually nothing to do with our big political institutions. And so I think that's kind of like how would that participation look in a world without borders? I think that's the interesting question for Luke and I. And I think there are seeds of people practicing that in all kinds of different projects everywhere, you know, in like campaign groups at their local food bank, you know, some configurations of like, what are they called? Like constituency Labour parties, people be having political fights there. Like there's all these different ways that we can be making ourselves heard. So yeah, I think we would be a real border abolitionist project. There would be all kinds of democracy, not just the vote.
All right, we have run out of time. I will say, Andreas, your new book is being launched in the 29th of November. Am I correct? Yes. Ask him more about it. They will both be signing books at the back. Please read the books. They are fantastic and very, very informative. And they're also wonderful people who will answer questions. So thank you so, so much, everybody, for joining us. Enjoy the fair. Have a great day. Thank you very much.
It's like, obviously it's good that everything has a mask up, but you can't make